Hello dear listeners and lovers of timeless tales. Crescent moon tonight, we invite you to leave behind the noise of the present and step into the candlelit streets of old Vienna, where snow muffles every footstep and secrets travel faster than the wind. It is the winter of 1791. The city sleeps under a silver moon, but at one small door, history is about to change forever. A man in a black cloak, face hidden, arrives with a strange request for a masterpiece, a requiem for an unknown soul. Alongside the payment in gold lies a curious gift, a glass vial filled with shimmering blue liquid, said to grant music a voice beyond the living world. From that moment, the days grow shorter, the shadows longer. The notes that pour from the composer's hand are beautiful and dangerous. Whispers begin to swirl through Vienna's narrow alleys, whispers of illness, of poison, of a bargain struck in the dark. Was this to be his crowning achievement, or his final breath? Join us now, as we step inside one of the most haunting legends in the history of music, the final days of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The winter wind caressed the mossy roofs of Vienna like the hand of an old nanny lulling the streets into darkness. The oil lamps hanging along Kärntnerstrasse breathed out flickering rings of fire, and the smell of horse-drawn carriages, of limestone powder, of fresh bread from the apprentices' ovens blended into a warm mist, covering the weary city. Above, the new moon was torn apart by a lace-like cloud, revealing a pale silver light like a sentinel's eye. In a small house near the market, a musician with hair as tangled as fire and eyes as bright as the Danube sunset sat silently, his hands resting on the keys of an old clavichord, listening to his heart count the beats like a doorkeeper at a chapel. The knock on the door rang 3 times, steady, unhurried, like the sound of a silversmith's hammer on raw silver, melancholy but precise. The musician looked up. In the room, the candle sighed, dropping a drop of wax white as winter dew on the edge of the table. The servant hurried down the stairs. The door opened, and the cold wind and the smell of fresh snow poured in. On the threshold stood a stranger in a black cloak with silver buttons, standing still as a statue. His face was hidden behind a half-moon silk mask, only his eyes, ageless, were visible, like the eyes of someone who knew the smell of church better than the smell of the market. He placed a paper package tied with a gray ribbon on the table before the servant and whispered harsh words. Like the sound of a violin string breaking in a box. "Give it to him," he said, without counting, without asking questions. Then the cloaked figure turned and retreated into the night, as light as a falcon. When the package was opened, the gold coins tied tightly like stars fell into the palm. Attached was a thin sheet of paper, written in a slanted style, the pen soft but decisive, a requiem. No name of the author. Deadline is when winter touches the pillow of December. All expenses have been paid for. The musician's eyes sparkled, but in that glow there was a faint cloud. He picked up the paper, feeling it cold as frosted glass. His wife, her brown hair soft as a swallow's wing, looked at her husband. "Who is that?" she asked softly, as if afraid to awaken the figures hiding in the corner of the house. "Requiem," the musician repeated, like someone mumbling a mantra. He placed his hand on his chest, hearing his heart respond with a strangely deep beat. Perhaps, he smiled like someone tasting a little fine wine, "it is grace." That night, the keyboard was like a field, and the pen was like a plow carving out musical furrows on the paper. The black and white notes grow like rice sprouts in the mist, each sprout summoning a handful of earth from memory, the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral on a rainy morning, the singing of children running around the square, the sound of ladies' and gentlemen's shoes falling like small hailstones in the ballroom. But slumbering somewhere in the music beds is another seed, as thin as a hair, carrying the dark scent of a garden no one enters. One night, when the clock in the church tower struck 12, the man in the black cloak returned. He stood in the doorway, the cold air surrounding him like a wreath of icy laurels. "Sir," he said, his voice as deep as the lungs of a clarinet, "the song for the dead needs the blood of the living. Write it with human pulses, not ink." Then he placed a small flask on the table, capped with wax. In it was a clear crystal liquid, but when tilted, a strange green sheen clung to the glass walls. The musician looked at it for a long time as if it were an old dream. "What is this?" he asked, without looking up. "It is silence," the man in the cloak replied, "the silence distilled from the darkness of confessionals and the breath of those who lie on the ground. A drop in the vein will make the instrument speak in a language no one can hear." The woman shrank back, her hands clasped together. She wanted to say something, but the words stuck in her throat like a rose thorn. As for the musician, his eyes glowed with a terrible light, like a torch in a coal mine. "Leave the jar here," he said. "Music knows its way." After the stranger had retreated into the night, the room was filled with candlelight again. The musician went to the bed and touched his forehead to his wife's. "There is little time," he whispered, "and little breath. But I will fulfill this dream." The next morning, a white mist covered Vienna like a wedding veil. The musician, his hand trembling slightly, poured a drop of silence into a glass of herbal water, the kind the doctor had prescribed for a feverish cough. The water smelled of mint, but at the bottom of the glass there was a faint, strange scent, like moonlight on the tip of a knife. He drank, and felt a coolness run down his spine, awakening the deep sleep of his childhood. As he put down his pen, the notes ran out like schools of fish, forming black rivulets that converged into an estuary. Everything was suddenly so clear. The violas were purple clouds, the oboes were two little birds perched on the black shoulders of the priest. The trombones were an open tomb, and in the middle of it all was a human voice, oh, a human voice, like ashes blown into fire. But at the same time, a strange fatigue began to drain him like a wizard pulling a red thread from a skein of wool. At first, he only had to pause longer between each phrase. Then he needed to lie down on the green velvet chair and listen to his heart beating out of rhythm. His sweat had a faint metallic smell. His wife pressed a warm towel to her forehead, her eyes like rain-soaked leaves, and said nothing. "Some say you are writing a funeral oration for yourself," joked the printer when he came to collect the draft of the Kyrie. The composer smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "Everybody has one," he replied, "only some have heard it while they were alive." The printer shivered slightly, then bowed quickly and walked away, leaving behind the smell of ink and new paper. The days passed like pages that fell from a notebook, fell to the floor, and disappeared under the foot of the dresser. Every night, the man in the black cloak came, bringing more money, more gentle urgings, more threats. Christmas Eve waits for no one. Each time, he stood a distance from the threshold, as if there was an invisible rope stretched between them, and if he took a step forward, he would hear the snap. In a coffee shop that smelled of smoke and cinnamon, people whispered stories like small fires, that there was a jealous hand in the darkness, that there was a curse steeped in black wine, that there was a song so beautiful that the world could not bear its writer. In the corner of the shop, a middle-aged man, holding a cup of hot chocolate, listened to it all without speaking. His lips pursed, his eyes like broken glass. When he stood up, his cloak brushed the table, a streak of powdered sugar fell on his black shoes. Someone recognized him, called him by name with half respect, half fear, and then fell silent, as if they had called the name of a star that might fall at any moment. In the musician's room, winter added another blanket to the city. At night, the snow reached the windows, and the sound of the rickshaws was gone, only the wind whirred in front of the roof like a deep brass trumpet. The musician sat upright, his hands gripping the edge of the table. In front of him, the page of Lacrimosa was not closed. The notes were like unshed tears, hanging on the long eyelashes of a woman looking at a grave. He tried to write another measure, but his hand was heavy as if bound with stones. He chuckled softly, and a cough tightened his back. Blood rose to his throat. The wife ran to him and hugged him. "Enough," she pleaded, "let's leave the paper for tonight." But he shook his head, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him, where someone seemed to be standing, his black cloak swaying like a wave of poplar. "Not yet," he whispered, "not yet. They're waiting." He reached out as if to touch someone who didn't exist, and as his hand fell, it caught on the glass. The glass shook, the green light rolling on the glass like a cat's eye in the night. The wife grabbed it in a panic, holding it. She paused, as if realizing something, then hid the glass in a drawer, locking it with a key as small as a silver fish. The next morning, a young priest with soapy hands came to visit, bringing bread and a blessing. The priest looked at the musician like a candle burning close to its wick, the flame reaching high but the embers falling softly. "Have you reconsidered your rest and medication?" the priest asked, his voice like a gently plucked string. The musician smiled, the smile of someone who is about to tell a good story, but then just shook his head. "Music is medicine," he said. The priest wanted to say more, but his wife's eyes stopped him. "There are rivers that should no longer be damned." That night, the cloaked man did not come. Instead, there was a blinding snowstorm, and the distant sound of singing from the church sounded like the sound of white weaving. The musician fell into a deep sleep, and in his dreams he passed through a winter garden. The stone statues of young girls were covered with soft snow feathers, and crows sat on their shoulders like black dots on a frame. At the end of the garden was a banquet table, spread with a white cloth. On the table, there was a glass of sparkling wine, a piece of broken bread, and in the middle was a small glass carafe, the soft green of duck's neck. From the shadows behind the trees, a voice spoke, "Neither old nor young, you have drunk too little." The musician woke up, his sweat cold as the night rain. On the table, the candle had gone out, only a thin thread of smoke weaving the shadow. He wanted to call his wife, but stopped, not knowing why. He slowly got up, walked towards the cupboard. The small key was no longer in the lock. He bent down, saw it lying at the foot of the cupboard, like a dead silver fish. He picked it up, his hand shaking. When the cupboard door opened, the vase lay there, its blue eyes silent. He took it, and for a moment, he saw in the glass not his own face, but a crowd, people in black cloaks, carrying candles, carrying songs, walking in a line in a white night, their steps not touching the ground. Outside, the wind broke a branch. A dry crack sounded, then silence. The musician put the vase down, and took a step back. He closed the cupboard, locked it. He listened to the room. His wife's breathing in her sleep. The sound of mice gnawing on the wood under the threshold. The sound of his heart, like an African drum carrying the rhythm of the red soil. Then he turned to the table, opened the Lacrimosa page. Pen touched paper. From the tip of the fountain, another black river flowed, opening into a sky both strange and familiar. The next morning, the illness was severe. The fever broke in like a thief, walking barefoot on the wooden floor, leaving no footprints but carrying with it the smell of ashes. The wife sent the servant to fetch the doctor. The doctor came, eyes squinting behind his glasses, put his ear to the musician's chest, listened like a poacher listening to the animals in the forest. "Limit strange things," he said, glancing around the room, pausing for a moment at the drawer. "Use only warm water, familiar herbs." Then he placed on the table a packet of white powder, saturated with honey water. As the doctor left, the wind changed direction. From somewhere, a faint scent of lilies of the valley drifted in the middle of winter. The musician opened his eyes. "Listen," he whispered. The wife leaned in, hearing only the wind. "I hear them," he said, "the sleepless ones, standing around the bed, wanting to sing." She stroked his hand, her heart filled with an unnamed fear. Late in the afternoon, the cloaked man returned, without knocking. He seemed to come out of the wall, to the table, looking at the manuscript pages piled in a corner. He reached out, touched the edge of the paper lightly, like someone testing the ripeness of fruit. "Almost done," he said. "But the night is growing short." The wife stood between him and the bed. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A man who keeps his word," he said. "The song needs an end. Otherwise it will get lost and not find its lie down." And then he placed a small box on the table, wrapped in black velvet. "For tonight," he said. Without waiting for an answer, he disappeared down the hall, leaving a cold wind that made the candle bow its head. The wife opened the box, a silver ring, engraved with symbols like the old river. In the center was a small stone, leaden gray. She did not touch it, only closed the box. She sat down beside her husband. "No more," she said, "let's rest." The musician looked at her, like a mountaineer looking at the pass behind him. Knowing there was another step ahead, but his knees were already heavy with lead. "Just a little," he said softly, "just a little." Night huddled around the house. Vienna slept peacefully. The cart stopped rolling, the windows closed. Above, a torn cloud drifted, revealing a patch of sky like faded silver. In the small room, the sound of a pen scraping paper was as quiet as a needle in fabric. The musician wrote until his hand could no longer lift it. He put down the pen. On the page, a musical phrase opened his lips, then stopped. He tilted his head, hearing the next note coming from far away, like a bell in the mist. He smiled, the smile of someone meeting a close friend in a dream. In the kitchen, the kettle was gently boiling. The wife poured warm water, mixed it with a little honey, and brought it up. She brought the cup to her husband's lips. The warmth spread. For a moment, his eyes were as clear as glass. In the depths of them, there was a winter forest and a white road leading to a small house where people sang tirelessly. He took a sip, then another, short. She put down the cup, turned away and straightened the blanket. When she turned back, she saw that his lips were pale, and a shadow of gray passed over the corner of his mouth, a shadow as fragile as the shadow of a cloud on a lake. She paused. The light swayed. On the other side, the cupboard was closed, the key lying neatly on the top like a silver fish resurrected, glistening. Outside, the distant bell rang for vespers. A wind whistled through the chimney, carrying the scent of fresh snow. The musician placed his hand on his chest, his eyes half closed. From his lips, a whisper fell like the first snow, Lacrimosa. And in the silence that followed, there was a very light sound of footsteps passing through the corridor, then stopping right in front of the door. The door did not open. But the doorknob was cold, as if someone had just put a hand on it. The candle popped softly like a grain of salt in fire, a cloud drifted across the moon, then stood still. Vienna entered the last days of the year like an old man wearing a thick blanket, still leaning on a stick to go out, but each step was slow and heavy. The sun, when it rose, was just a faded silver coin, hanging over the top of St. Stephen's Tower, then quickly hiding in the dark alleys. The white mist did not melt but crawled close to the ground. Mixed with human breath, with the smell of black bread, with the sound of dewy horse hooves, turning into a thin film between people, in that thin film, rumors like grains of rice falling into moist soil, sprouted silently. People talked about him, without calling his name, but everyone understood. That he was tired not because of illness, but because someone had dropped something into the glass he was drinking. That it was neither medicine nor wine, but diluted darkness. People recalled parties where his glass was always filled first, meals where a separate plate was placed before him, arranged in an unusually beautiful manner. Some swore that, during a performance, they saw a pale hand pour a few drops of jade green into his glass. No one knew whether it was real or imaginary, only that the story was passed on like a looped melody, each time adding a new note. The days passed like pages that fell from a notebook, fell to the floor, and disappeared under the foot of the dresser. Every night, the man in the black cloak came, bringing more money, more gentle urgings, more threats. Christmas Eve waits for no one. Each time, he stood a distance from the threshold, as if there was an invisible rope stretched between them, and if he took a step forward, he would hear the snap. In a coffee shop that smelled of smoke and cinnamon, people whispered stories like small fires, that there was a jealous hand in the darkness, that there was a curse steeped in black wine, that there was a song so beautiful that the world could not bear its writer. In the corner of the shop, a middle-aged man, holding a cup of hot chocolate, listened to it all without speaking. His lips pursed, his eyes like broken glass. When he stood up, his cloak brushed the table, a streak of powdered sugar fell on his black shoes. Someone recognized him, called him by name with half respect, half fear, and then fell silent, as if they had called the name of a star that might fall at any moment. In the musician's room, winter added another blanket to the city. At night, the snow reached the windows, and the sound of the rickshaws was gone, only the wind whirred in front of the roof like a deep brass trumpet. The musician sat upright, his hands gripping the edge of the table. In front of him, the page of Lacrimosa was not closed. The notes were like unshed tears, hanging on the long eyelashes of a woman looking at a grave. He tried to write another measure, but his hand was heavy as if bound with stones. He chuckled softly, and a cough tightened his back. Blood rose to his throat. The wife ran to him and hugged him. "Enough," she pleaded, "let's leave the paper for tonight." But he shook his head, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him, where someone seemed to be standing, his black cloak swaying like a wave of poplar. "Not yet," he whispered, "not yet. They're waiting." He reached out as if to touch someone who didn't exist, and as his hand fell, it caught on the glass. The glass shook, the green light rolling on the glass like a cat's eye in the night. The wife grabbed it in a panic, holding it. She paused, as if realizing something, then hid the glass in a drawer, locking it with a key as small as a silver fish. The next morning, a young priest with soapy hands came to visit, bringing bread and a blessing. The priest looked at the musician like a candle burning close to its wick, the flame reaching high but the embers falling softly. "Have you reconsidered your rest and medication?" the priest asked, his voice like a gently plucked string. The musician smiled, the smile of someone who is about to tell a good story, but then just shook his head. "Music is medicine," he said. The priest wanted to say more, but his wife's eyes stopped him. "There are rivers that should no longer be dammed." That night, the cloaked man did not come. Instead, there was a blinding snowstorm, and the distant sound of singing from the church sounded like the sound of white weaving. The musician fell into a deep sleep, and in his dreams he passed through a winter garden. The stone statues of young girls were covered with soft snow feathers, and crows sat on their shoulders like black dots on a frame. At the end of the garden was a banquet table, spread with a white cloth. On the table, there was a glass of sparkling wine, a piece of broken bread, and in the middle was a small glass carafe, the soft green of duck's neck. From the shadows behind the trees, a voice spoke, "Neither old nor young, you have drunk too little." In the room on the small street, where the candles had burned down to their short legs, he lay listening to time pass by like water dripping from the roof after a storm. Every time he woke up, he would look for the Requiem. The music sheets were scattered everywhere, as if snow had crept into the room and settled on every table and every wooden chair. Sometimes, he dreamed that the pages were not paper, but pieces of mourning cloth blown by the wind. He tried to write the next note, but when he put down the pen, it turned into a dry flower branch, broken in half in his hand. His wife still took care of him. Her eyes were increasingly swollen from lack of sleep. She lit more fire, mixed herbs, and placed them by the bed, but he only took a few sips. Sometimes, she saw him holding the pen, his hands shaking, but his eyes seemed to be looking through an invisible window. She followed that direction, seeing only white walls. But he nodded slightly, as if he were talking to someone. One night, when the street was asleep, she suddenly woke up to the sound of a chair being moved. He got out of bed, put on a thin robe, and walked to the chest of drawers. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting a pale silver color on his face. The key was already on top of the chest of drawers. He opened it, took out a blue glass bottle, and held it up to his eyes. In that moment, she saw his lips move slightly, as if singing a short, soundless sentence. "Don't." She called softly, but she didn't know if it was out of worry or fear. He put the bottle back, locked the chest. Without turning to look at her, he walked to the table and opened the music sheet. The moonlight slid over the notes, turning them into silver symbols, like the writing of someone so ancient that no one could read them anymore. The next day the doctor returned. He examined him briefly, but his eyes lingered for a long time on the musician's hands, where the joints stood out like white stakes. "You must stop working," the doctor said, his voice more stern than before. "For a while." The musician smiled wearily. "If I stop, time will do the rest." When the doctor left, it was snowing. The snow sounded like crumpled paper. And then, through the snow, a figure in a black cloak appeared, this time without a face. His face was waxy white, without a wrinkle, neither old nor young. He entered, glanced quickly at the drawer, and placed a letter sealed with black wax on the table. "Winter is almost over," he said. "And people cannot wait." The man did not open the letter. He tilted his head, looking straight at him. "You know where you are going. There is only one path. If you want it to be complete, let me lead the way." There was a long silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the crack in the door. Then, very slowly, he reached out and touched the envelope. His fingers slid across the black wax like someone searching for underground water. The seal was cold, engraved with a strange symbol, a circle split by a diagonal line, and in the middle was a small dot like a half-closed eye. As the wax cracked, a smell wafted up, not old paper, not essential oils, but the smell of a newly opened crypt, damp, cold, and faintly metallic. Inside the envelope was a thin sheet of paper, written in brown ink that had turned the color of autumn leaves. The handwriting was as winding as a river flowing in the darkness. "On the last moonlit night of the month, the song will be carried away. If it is not finished, the missing part will be written by another hand. If it is finished, you will sleep peacefully in your own song." The musician looked at the words as if looking into an abyss, knowing that once he entered, there would be no turning back. He put down the paper, his thin shoulders shaking slightly. The black cloak stood still as a statue, waiting for an answer. "How much time?" he asked, his voice hoarse like the sound of a string that has not been tuned for a long time. "A week, maybe less," the cloaked man replied without thinking. "You heard the call, I only came to make sure it was not lost." The wife stepped forward, her eyes as sharp as needles, but also as moist as the surface of a lake before the rain. "Why did you come here?" she asked, almost defiantly. "For my husband's music or for his life?" He bowed his head slightly, his lips moving as if to smile but not to laugh, "For both. No one can separate them anymore." In the days that followed, the room became a closed world. Outside, Vienna was still covered in snow, there were still carriages passing by and church bells ringing, but inside the room, all sound seemed to be absorbed into the Requiem. New paper was placed on the table, black ink was added every morning. He wrote like a miner, digging into a seam of coal known only to him. Whenever he was too tired, he leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and his lips still moved the melodies that had not yet been written down. One night, in a fever, he sat up and called out a name that was not there. His wife rushed to his side, but he put his hand to his mouth, signaling silence. She heard something from the dark corner of the room, not a voice, not even the wind. It was like a chord resonating from beneath the wooden floor, low and deep, shaking the listener's chest. When she turned on the light, the dark corner was just a dark corner. On Thursday morning, when the snow was as thin as frost on the roof, he called his wife over. "I want you to put this away," he said, handing her a green velvet bag. Inside were several folded pages of sheet music, the paper slightly stained as if it had been kept for a long time. If I can't, then don't let anyone touch them but you." She held the bag, feeling the corners of the paper as sharp as knives, but also as fragile as dry leaves. She was about to ask, but he was already back at the table, holding a pen. The morning light that day shone through the window, casting a silver halo over his shoulders. He looked like the bust of a weary angel in a winter cemetery. The moon was late in the month, and the moon hung like a silver knife in the sky. The sound of distant horses' hooves, the crackling of a fire in the hearth, and somewhere, footsteps stopped at the door. The cloaked man entered, this time carrying a long, narrow wooden box. He placed the box on the table and opened it. Inside, lined with red velvet, was a brand new brush, its silver handle engraved with strange characters, and a small bottle of blue ink. "The instrument to write the finale," he said. "Are you ready?" The musician looked at the pen like a soldier looks at the last sword. He reached out, then stopped, turning to his wife. In that moment, the wind outside suddenly stopped, as if the whole city was holding its breath. She nodded, very slowly. He picked up the pen, the blue ink touched the paper, and from there, the last notes began to fall like silent snowflakes, but each one carried a strange chill, penetrating deep into the marrow. The sound of the pen sliding on the paper was like the sound of silk being torn, thin and tough. Each stroke followed by a small echo like the whisper of someone standing close to his ear. The musician wrote without stopping, the music flowing out like an underground stream breaking its banks. Each note falling on the paper made the room seem to shrink, the wall closer, the air thicker. The wife stood by, not daring to interrupt. She felt as if an invisible audience were crowded in the four corners of the room, all silent, watching the movements of that skinny hand. For a moment, she heard footsteps, the rustle of cloth, but when she glanced up, there was only the dancing shadow of the candle. When the last phrase of the Lacrimosa ended, he put down his pen and sat still. The candlelight fell on his face, clearly showing the lines of his bones and the deep shadows of his eyes. He looked down at the music like a father looking at a newborn child he knew he would not have long to raise. The cloaked man, from his place hidden behind the door, stepped out. He walked to the table, his black-gloved hands turning each page. With each turn, he nodded slightly, his eyes hard to tell whether he was pleased or regretful. When he reached the last page, he paused, his fingers lightly tracing the last line, as if to feel the heartbeat still hidden in the ink. "It's done," he said softly, his voice low and deep like a bell echoing from the ground. "Now, you can rest." The musician smiled, but there was something both liberating and bitter in the smile. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes slightly. A long breath escaped him, carrying with it the last bit of warmth in his body. The wife knelt beside him in panic, took his hand, and felt the cold creeping from her fingers into her hand, then up her wrist. The cloaked man did not come any closer. He stood there, holding the music sheet in his hand, like a messenger whose mission had been accomplished. "They are waiting," he said, looking into the space behind him. The musician opened his mouth. A single word escaped, very soft, but clear, "Amen." Outside, the night wind rose, sweeping through the empty streets, bringing with it the smell of fresh snow and the long ringing of church bells. For a moment, moonlight streamed in through the window, and she, the wife, saw around the bed figures in black, each holding a blue burning candle, eyes half closed, mouths moving to a tune she could not hear. She rubbed her eyes. When she opened them, the room was all alone with her husband, in absolute silence. The Requiem had disappeared from the table. The key to the drawer lay rolling on the floor, shining like a small silver fish. The next day, Vienna woke up under a thick fog. The early morning cries were swallowed up, the sound of horses' hooves sounded like an echo from a dream. And on a street corner, people told each other that, last night, in St. Stephen's Cathedral, someone had heard a strange melody coming from inside. Even though the church was closed and no one had entered, the wife said nothing. She just sat by the window, looking down at the snow-covered street, her hand resting on her lap as if holding something invisible. A faint melody still lingered in her ears, as if someone had not completely left. As the years passed, Vienna took on a new look. The blue-tiled roofs had faded, the alleys where the snow had once slept had been paved over, and the old cafes were now filled with the youthful laughter of those who had not yet known what loss was. But on windless winter nights, when the new moon hung low like a silver coin on the top of St. Stephen's Tower, the old people still told the story as if it had happened yesterday. They said that there were nights when the church was closed, the interior as dark as an inkwell, but from deep within the cold stone the Requiem would echo, note for note, without a difference, even though no one was sitting in front of the choir. The music echoed not from the pipes, not from the strings, but as if it were coming from the very walls, the very stones that had drunk the last breath of its writer. Some swore they had seen, in the moonlight, a slender figure in an old cloak, with hair as tangled as fire, standing on the highest balcony of the bell tower, waving his arms as if conducting an invisible orchestra. When they looked up again, there was only the moon and the clouds, but a thin blue halo still hovered where he had stood. The wife of that time had also disappeared from Vienna in a spring no one remembered. Their house was locked, the windows covered with dust, but on the wooden table in the upstairs room, people found a green velvet bag. Inside, instead of music sheets, was a small silver key. The silver fish had closed its life cycle, and a piece of paper with only 4 words on it: "They are still waiting for you." Since then, every winter, on the last moonlit night of the month, dreamers, or those who wandered through the narrow street where the musician once lived, would hear music from somewhere, not near, not far, and the faint scent of lilies of the valley, even in the midst of the white snow. They followed the music, but the street grew longer and longer, until the music ended, and they found themselves standing in front of an old wooden door, without hinges or handles. On the door was carved a symbol of a circle split in 2, with a small dot in the middle like a half-closed eye. The door had never been opened, but it was believed that if anyone had passed through, they would have found a hall filled with blue candles. And at the end of the hall, the musician sitting at his piano, writing the song that no one had heard until the end, and so the story of his death never ended, like his Requiem itself, forever suspended between 2 notes, neither belonging to the living nor entirely to the dead.